these systems are great at certain kinds of things that people didn't realize that a machine like this would be good at. They're good at originality, creativity of a certain kind, style. Even GPT-3, trained on some work of Daniel Dennett, could write paragraphs in answers to questions that people who know Dennett's work had a hell of a time distinguishing from the actual Dennett answer to the same question. So they can do certain things. At the same time, they can't do 4-digit multiplication. A few days ago in my undergraduate class, I gave the paid version of GPT 4.0 a 4-digit multiplication problem, and it got it wrong. They can't do rules and representations.
In undergrad, my favorite class was philosophy of mind, and my favorite paper in that class was your paper, Psychologism and Behaviorism. And that is where I want to get started, talking about intelligence. Sure. But before we get there, since that was my entry into philosophy of mind, I'm wondering how you got interested in philosophy of mind.
Well, I was an engineering student at MIT starting in 1960. And my very first day, I went to a required humanities course, which was taught by Hubert Dreyfus, famous phenomenology and existentialism philosopher. And he was such a compelling teacher that got me. I had never been interested in philosophy before. I thought I was going to be an electrical engineer.
Oh, really? I can tell you're very interested in devices.
I do. I like devices. I made devices. I worked as a TD repairman. Yeah. So when I was in high school, I liked it. Anyway, but so he got me interested in philosophy, and then in my second year, Hillary Putnam started at MIT.
Oh wow!
And I took a course from him, and I took the course from him one or more every semester. He was incredible, and I lost interest in phenomenology and existentialism, but one of his major interests was philosophy of mind and also minds and machines, and that's how I got interested in it, I think. I also took a course at that time from John Rawls, 2 courses, in fact, 2 introductory philosophy courses from Rawls. And, I had the best philosophy education anybody's ever had.
I'm just chuckling to myself right now because this trip has been going by so quickly that I haven't realized that I'm sitting down with one of my favorite philosophers and somebody who wrote my favorite paper. It's just very cool. But you mentioned Hillary, and I mentioned that I spoke with Barry Lower earlier today. We talked. It was more of a pedagogically focused episode on the philosophy of science, and naturally Hillary Putnam came up a lot.
Oh yeah.
He told we were mainly talking about the no miracles argument with regard to scientific realism.
Yeah.
But he told a funny story about how he almost killed Hillary Putnam, and nobody knows this, but I guess he took him out in Boston Harbor and Hillary fell overboard, and
really?
He could have drowned, but Barry pulled him out and saved him. But I just wanted to ask you, since you brought this Titan up, what studying with him was like. Anything funny?
He was incredible. In those days, 62 to 64, when I was his undergraduate student, he was just a fountain of ideas. And he was like a scrappy kid. He didn't have any pretensions. He just was so interested in everything and had lots of things to say about everything. He was just an amazing figure. Then I spent 2 years in Oxford and came back and studied with him he was my PhD advisor. And he was a changed man. Then he suddenly started, smoking pipes and, wearing professor clothes and he just he would read his lectures, and he suddenly had a view of himself as a historical figure. And he was nowhere near as exciting then as he was when I was an undergrad. So, those days were just golden. I should say that also Rawls was pretty incredible as an undergraduate teacher. He taught my Introduction to Philosophy 1 and Introduction to Philosophy 2. I was also before his major giant book on justice. And he had written one article he had only written 4 articles at that point. And he wasn't defending anything. He was just like open to everything. Later, he became more defensive, I think. So and then, in my senior year, I took a course from Philippa Foote, who was visiting MIT, and she taught a course on Wittgenstein versus Locke. She was a very strong proponent of Wittgenstein, and I discovered I was a strong proponent of Locke. And, one of the issues that came up was issues to do with the inverted spectrum and stuff like that, and I had long taken that seriously. That's the idea that things that we both call red look to you the way things we both call green look to me. And I thought, this makes sense. And she thought, makes no sense. So, that was when I think my identity as a philosopher of mind got forged in that course.
Are there any particular contributions that Putnam made that really stick out to you as extremely important?
Oh, yeah. He formulated and argued for the view known as functionalism, which says that you should think of the identity of mental states in terms of their causes in sensory apparatus, their effects on behavior, but most importantly, the effects of other mental states, both the causes and effects in other mental states. So, and he gave a way of thinking about that. In his early articles, he called these functional states logical states and argued that they weren't the same thing as a mental state. Later, he realized that was a mistake and argued that they were the same thing. And that's been it's a hugely influential view in philosophy of mind.
One of the things that I was curious about, and maybe I'll add a little bit more color to this question, I was talking to one of my really close friends, Jared, who I know you also know from NYU, Jared Warren. People have heard me describe him as just this amazing philosopher.
As he is, yeah.
As he is, but he doesn't love doing interviews. He's a very private.
I do very few interviews too.
Yeah, I know. I'm lucky. I'm lucky in this case. But I asked him what he would think about me doing a joint interview with you and your colleague, Dave Chalmers. And what Jared told me was, you two are both brilliant philosophers. You both do philosophy of mind, but you both have very different methodologies and attitudes. And it would be a really interesting conversation, but that was something to keep in mind.
Sure.
And so what I wanted...
I'd be up for that.
Okay, in the future. But what I wanted to ask you about was why it is that you found yourself taking such a neuroscience focus and other cognitive science focus attitude toward philosophy of mind when there are other routes being taken.
Yeah. So I think that neuroscience is the right approach for consciousness. I think everything we know about consciousness has to do with the brain. There's been very little in the way of any information we've gotten from psychology or AI, for that matter. However, when it comes to the thought and reasoning, we have learned a huge amount from recent AI, namely these large language models that do a form of autocomplete, and they have told us that. So let me back up a minute. So these systems are great at certain kinds of things that people didn't realize that a machine like this would be good at. They're good at originality, creativity of a certain kind, style. For example, even GPT-3, trained on some work of Daniel Dennett, could write paragraphs in answers to questions that people who know Dennett's work had a hell of a time distinguishing from the actual Dennett answer to the same question. So they're amazing in their ability. There was a poem published in the New Yorker where somebody trained it on some poems by Philip Larkin. And they said, write a Philip Larkin poem on cryptocurrency. And it's astonishing.
Yeah.
So they can do certain things. At the same time, they can't do 4-digit multiplication. A few days ago in my undergraduate class, I gave the paid version of GPT 4.0, ChatGPT, a 4-digit multiplication problem, and it got it wrong. They can't do rules and representations. So one thing we've learned from recent AI is that, to our surprise, the certain aspects of the mind are far more amenable to this neural net approach than the kind of reasoning we associate with standard digital computers. So that was really, I thought that's a major discovery of the 21st century in my view.
I interviewed Noam Chomsky a couple of months before he had his stroke. It's actually a pretty interesting story. I might have just told it on another podcast, but I spoke with him in March. It was wonderful. At that time, I was doing interviews out of my apartment. I didn't have this. And it was an episode, obviously the most exciting episode I ever could have done. That was the episode in which my cat decided that she had to be the star of the show, and she was running around all over the place, and it drove me nuts. But in that interview, he said that he did not think we could learn anything about the human mind or language learning from LLMs just because they function so differently from human minds. That he referenced impossible languages. That was one thing he wanted to talk about. Yeah. And I think this is also around the time that New York Times piece came out. But how do you feel about that claim that Chomsky made?
Well, first let me say I knew him pretty well. I taught at MIT for 25 years. Yeah. My office was across the hall
Jared
from
told
his.
Me that.
And so he's a super incredible person. But I think he just doesn't realize how important these AI models are. I don't know how much they can tell us about language. Famously, some of the AI people say, whenever I fire a linguist, my model gets better. But they certainly have told us a huge amount about human thought, about what aspects of the mind are subject to this kind of autocomplete kind of account. And that's a very important discovery. By the way, I should say that I was in an AI discussion group for a number of years, and we had a lot of AI people in that. And when these models started to get really good with GPT-3, they're all completely shocked about how good they were. Nobody in the profession expected they would be this good.
Well, now I'm glad that ChatGPT came up organically because it is definitely relevant to what we're about to talk about. And what I have in mind is psychologism and behaviorism and the question of intelligence. And first, just because I don't want to assume too much background for our listeners, and I'd like to be as specific as we can, what is the Turing Test and how does it work and what's it supposed to show?
Yeah, so the Turing Test is an idea formulated by the mathematician and to some extent philosopher Turing, A.M. Turing, in 1950 in his famous article in Mind.
In Mind, and that's a philosophy journal.
Yeah, it's a philosophy journal. And so he proposed a test in which you have a judge and then in one room a human and another room a machine communicating by teletype, because that was the interface that they had then. And he proposed that the passing the test would be the inability of the human judge to distinguish between the machine and the human subject. And look, people quickly realized that was a silly test. Turing himself.
Oh, really? Because it's still talked about so much.
Oh, it's talked about so much because it's a test, and everybody wants a test for intelligence. By the way, by intelligence, he meant thought. The word intelligence is in the title of his paper, but it's only used once in the paper where he's just talking about thinking and reasoning. So he means intelligence in the sense of the possession of thought or reason. And he admits in the article that an intelligent machine might fail the test because the judge might know enough to distinguish a machine from a person, like maybe the machine would be too fast or something. And then he relied on the idea that passing the test would be sufficient for intelligence in that thought sense. But we discovered very quickly that naive people are fooled by a very dumb system. So the system that, we had real Turing tests for a while, funded by a weird guy named Hugh Loebner. And I participated in these. I was a referee in the first one, and I was a judge in many of the other ones. And what we discovered in the beginning interviews was that we put in an ad in the newspaper for people who could type but didn't know anything about machines. Mm. And so we got some naive people in, and they were playing with this ELIZA program, extremely simple 100-line program in BASIC that just takes what you say and spews it back to you changed a bit with some other tricks. And these people thought they were talking to a person. So these naive humans thought they were talking to a person. So I think somebody who doesn't know anything can be fooled very easily by a mindless machine. And I think everybody in the community realized that the test really wasn't worth much. And now, of course, we've got ChatGPT, which can fool people very easily. Hmm. So naive people, don't know that it's a person they're talking to. Joe Weizenbaum, the guy who wrote the ELIZA program, described even one of his colleagues being fooled by the ELIZA program. So in those days, they had timeshare, and you were using a mainframe, and Joe had ELIZA up on the mainframe and was taking a nap in his office. And one of his colleagues, a professor of computer science at MIT, sent him a message saying, "Get off the machine, I need it." And then the ELIZA program answered and said things like, "Why do you want me to get off the machine? And why do you need it?" And stuff like that. And the guy came storming into Joe's office and was surprised to find that he was actually talking to a computer.
Cut me off at any point if you know what I'm about to say, because I'm sure if you do, you'll be able to tell the story much better than I can. But Dan Dennett, who I think you already mentioned, I was actually quite fortunate enough to have one of his last interviews. My 200th episode was joint one with him, Steve Pinker, and Sean Carroll, and it was really excellent. But something I think I got from his book, it's a story, one of his books, a story he tells about one of these early programs that fooled people. And what happened was it was a program that was meant to model a psychiatrist. Oh, yeah. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do know.
Could you tell that story? I mean, it's brief, but...
Yeah, so I think I don't know the story that you may have in mind, but I will say that the first Turing test was a guy who used Weizenbaum's program and fooled people very effectively by making it imitate a wild and crazy person who just spewed out nonsense and typos and stuff like that. And that was even more convincing to people than the original Weizenbaum program.
Well, I'll just finish the story that I was going to tell then.
This is, I think, Perry. It was a psychiatrist program called Perry, I think.
I'm not sure what it was called, but somebody's secretary got hold of this program.
Oh, and then, that's Weizenbaum.
That's
Weizenbaum's story. His secretary asked him to leave the room.
Yes, and
that is the original ELIZA program, which was meant to be a Rogerian psychiatrist.
Mm-hmm. But what was so funny about it was the program. It was explained how it worked, and if it reached a dead end or something like this, it would just say, "Does this remind you of your father?" After the person is communicating with this program, and Weizenbaum, I take it, walked into his office his secretary was talking to the program, and she was so convinced by it that she asked him to
Well,
leave the room.
what it did was it stored up keywords.
Hmm.
And the keywords included father, mother, love, hate, stuff like that. And then if it didn't know what else to do, it would use a keyword in an earlier utterance by the person to spew back something. Tell me more about your father.
Yeah, it was, anyway, very funny. I promise that I will take us right back on track, but while Dennett is up on the subject, and we've already talked a bit about Putnam and Chomsky, it might be worth asking you about Dennett, anything that comes to mind about your time that I'm sure you spent with him. I know you shared a student, Rosa Cow, who's now at
Yes,
Stanford.
that's right. She's a wonderful philosopher.
Yeah, absolutely excellent. And close friends with Jared, too.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, I was her PhD advisor, and Dan, she had something to do with him, but
Postdoc.
A postdoc,
Probably in the Center for Cognitive Science that Ian Jackendoff ran.
Right. Yeah, so I was at MIT all those years, and I did see him every once in a while. I didn't always have a good experience with him.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was there was something, he liked to be an entertainer.
Yeah.
And every dinner, I went to numerous dinners with him, and what would happen is he would tell some anecdote, a long anecdote, and he was a very amusing speaker. And then everybody in the dinner table would be quiet and listen, and then they would sort of be in a passive state. And then there was like a silence, and then he would jump in and fill it with another one. And what he would do is turn something that could be a conversation into a monologue. He was a bit of a he was a bit of an egomaniac, really.
Were there any interesting places, though, that your philosophy of mind either came together or really went apart from one another?
Well,
I might be anticipating
he
where we're
was an
getting.
illusionist.
Right.
And
he doesn't like that name, but this came up with Sean, actually, where he was saying, I'm an illusionist. It's a great name. And Sean was saying, no, it's a terrible name.
Yeah. So look, as he said often, it's a strategic decision to decide whether to say consciousness doesn't exist or to say it does exist and it isn't what you think. But that is, all the illusionists face that problem. And, he has many disciples, Keith Frankish,
Right.
Michael Graziano.
I've spoken with both of them on the show.
Oh, okay, yeah. And it's a respectable view, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And he argued for it very well. So I think his best work was the work he did with, what's his name, the psychologist, Kinsborn. That work on time, I think, was his best work. But, I reviewed the book, and the big problem with his work, from my point of view, was he was a very intuitive philosopher who would come out with views, and then the views could have a number of different interpretations, and he was never clear on which one he had in mind. And they were often incompatible. And, a lot of professional philosophers felt that it wasn't really first-class philosophy. Although he was a fountain of ideas, and he certainly has been an amazing figure, and both in philosophy and cognitive science. So he's a great figure in a certain way, but not in the way that appeals to a lot of philosophers.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up Michael Graziano, just because I, at some point in this conversation, would love to talk, at least briefly, about the attention schema theory of consciousness, because we've had a couple of conversations about it. I find it fascinating, and it's actually of moral importance in my life, which maybe we'll get to that.
Yeah. So his main work was on the body map.
Yep.
And we do have some kind of a map of our body, and it's important to muscle control. And he thought he would apply the same idea to consciousness and attention. He thinks we have a kind of attention map. But the only advocates of this are him and his students and other people who've worked with him. Nobody thinks this is a real theory of consciousness. The main reason is there's no evidence for the attention schema. In fact, the evidence goes against it. people don't even know where their eyes are pointing. They don't know where they're attending. Years ago, there was a attention map produced by a paper by Data and Dio, and that showed that we have an attention field with strengths in one place, weaknesses in another. It's a very complex thing, and people don't have any idea that their attention is distributed in the way that it is. So I think, the part about his view that I think is respectable is the illusionism. But the attention schema part, I think he's just trying to run with an idea that worked in another domain, and it doesn't really apply to consciousness. There are 4 main theories of consciousness, and the attention schema theory is not one of them. By main theories, I mean theories that are advocated by a lot of people, that are arguably not, cults of one person, although some people think that might not be true of the IIT. But theories that have some empirical support. And I don't think the attention schema theory is like that.
Thanks for rolling with the punches as we're kind of dancing around topics, but I will bring us back to psychologism and behaviorism.
Okay, sure.
But the reason that I'm interested in consciousness right now for a personal moral reason is in particular about animal minds. Because I am very concerned about not eating animals that I believe are capable of suffering.
Yeah.
And this is an anecdote that I was sharing with our technicians, our photographers with us.
Yeah.
And we were eating venison from Hawaii earlier today.
Yeah.
Because about 100 years ago, the emperor of Japan gave a gift of 10 axis deer, I think, to the king of Hawaii. They are now an invasive species. There are tens of thousands of them in Maui and other islands, and they are being culled. And this company, Maui Nui Venison, was given permission to kill them humanely and sell the meat, so at least something's happening with them. But anyway, that's the only mammals I eat, and one reason is that Jared Warren has convinced me that mammals are conscious.
Oh, I think that
all
too.
Of them.
I think everybody who works on consciousness thinks
so
that
does Michael
mammals are.
Graziano. But according to his attention schema theory of consciousness, no fish are conscious. The only creatures that are conscious are reptiles, birds, mammals, potentially sea creatures in the octopus family, and I think maybe some amphibians. But first I'll ask you, how do you go about the question of animal minds and animal consciousness?
Yeah, so this is not something I've worked on a lot, but I do agree with him about fish. And
really? That makes me so happy.
The reason I do is I think the study of consciousness depends on us, because we are the only creatures we know are conscious. And in us, it depends on a cortex. And, fish have only the tiniest little bit of something that's a precursor to cortex. And I think without a cortex, there's really a very low chance that something is conscious. And I don't know about these other, the amphibians or these other, to what extent.
Birds have a primitive cortex called the wall. And but this is exactly what Michael Graziano was saying, was that fish do not have the cortex. We need the cortex.
Well, I agree with him on that. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Do you have thoughts on octopus or other creatures? Or
look, the octopus brain is so different from every creature we know to have consciousness that we simply have no idea.
That's his feeling. He gives it 50-50.
Yeah, I don't know, 50. I wouldn't put a number on it. One mistake that is often made in the study of animal consciousness is to confuse intelligence with consciousness.
Yes.
And, people, think because something can pass some, animal IQ test that shows it's conscious. But I think those things are unrelated.
Okay, well, intelligence will immediately bring us back to where we were. So the last question I'll ask, because these are another class of creatures that I'm consuming. Shrimp. You agree that because they don't have cortices, they're not conscious?
It's a bit of a guesswork, but yes.
Okay.
You
Great.
can eat shrimp.
Great. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that.
I should say that according to 3 of the 4 main theories, well, 2 of them would certainly rule out creatures without a frontal cortex. That's the global workspace theory and the higher order thought theory or higher order pointer theory. Those are 2 of the main theories, and none of these animals without a prefrontal cortex would count as conscious, or some analog of it, like in birds, they have an analog of it. The first order theory put forward by Victor Lamé and some other people does require a sensory cortex, and fish don't have that either. So,
hey, great. This is music to my ears. Okay. We'll come back to consciousness, but for now, we'll go back to intelligence.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if you could say more about just what a naive judge is like, and then why or whether or not ChatGPT 4.0 passes the Turing test.
Yeah. So a naive judge is somebody who knows nothing about machines. And these people off the street, or we got through an ad in the first Turing test, were people which were so mesmerized by the fact that the ELIZA program could reply in what seemed to be a sensible way, although with very little content to it, just shooting what they say back to it. Those people were naive.
Okay. And again, getting into psychologism and behaviorism, what is it that makes the Turing test a behaviorist test?
Well, Turing wanted to replace the concept of thinking, intelligence in the sense of the possession of thought, with a purely behavioral test. Now, the big problem in behaviorism is trying to define what behavior to identify with a mental state. And he thought he'd solved that by letting the judge decide.
Yeah.
But then he didn't say anything about the mental qualities of the judge.
That is
And, if the judge was too knowledgeable, the judge would know the difference between a genuinely intelligent machine and a person. And if the judge was not knowledgeable enough, the judge would be fooled by dumb machines. So, by not specifying the mental qualities of the judge, which he couldn't do because he was a behaviorist, he thought he was getting rid of that idea. That's what made the Turing test die.
Okay, so another way of putting it maybe, or putting part of it, is that ChatGPT, whether or not it passes the Turing test, it's just not really well defined because the Turing test isn't well defined enough.
What's wrong with the Turing test is something quite specific. It's ill-defined in a number of ways, like how long the Turing test is supposed to last. But the ill-definedness that is the crucial ill-definedness is the failure to specify who the judge is and what the judge's mental qualities are. And that's a principal defect, because if you're going to have a purely behaviorist test, you can't make it depend on the mental qualities of the judge. But as I just mentioned, the mental qualities of the judge can make it go wrong in either direction.
I hadn't put this together, and it's been a few years since I read the paper, but it's occurring to me now that you reference, I believe it's Putnam's Super Spartans in this paper. So maybe toward introducing the blockhead, I should ask you about Putnam's Super Spartans and what they're supposed to illustrate that's relevant to the Turing test.
Yeah, so the Super Spartans, okay, so the idea is he has the Spartans who are very good at hiding the fact that when they're in pain. They don't grimace, but if the pain takes them by surprise, they will, they'll wince or something. Then he imagines super Spartans who are really good at it, maybe with a bit of genetic engineering or such. And then he imagines the super Spartans who are perfect at imitating somebody who doesn't have pain in many different respects. And his idea was, well, you could if you could decode their thoughts using brain imaging or something, then you would know they're in pain because they're saying to themselves, the language areas have thoughts that are, oh no, I'm in excruciating pain, but I mustn't let on. So his idea was, in terms of external behavior, a being could behave exactly as if it had no pain, but really be in pain.
Well, looking at their thoughts will certainly bring us into the terrain of information processing. So
Yeah.
I'll hold off on that for now. But why does the super Spartan example pose a problem for the Turing test?
Well, as I said, Turing gave up on the Turing test as a necessary condition because he allowed that an intelligent machine might not want to pass, or that the judge might know the difference between an intelligent machine and a person. The machine might be too fast or too accurate or something like that. But he settled on the Turing test as a sufficient condition. And the super Spartans are a counterexample to the sufficient condition. They are creatures that behave just like they're not in pain, but they are in pain.
So the equivalent would be somehow creatures or a candidate in the Turing test that behaves as if it is intelligent. So it's indistinguishable from a human, but it is not intelligent.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And that's what my blockhead is supposed to be.
Exactly. So the blockhead, this very famous thought experiment, I take it you didn't name it, the blockhead?
No, I didn't. That was a name given to it by Frank Jackson.
Okay.
And
I love Frank.
yeah. Well, Brad Mitchell and Jackson is a text. And I learned later, I mean, I didn't know this, that the Australians, philosophers, tended to call it the blockhead. And it's the way that it's gotten popularized is by this philosophy of mind text by Brad Mitchell and Jackson.
Well, maybe since Frank has come up, and since, interestingly, he named your thought experiment, which I think is this tremendously great thought experiment, it would be worth asking you if you could explain his huge thought experiment, which he has since, he no longer believes it to be correct, but I wonder how you explain it, how you feel about it, where you think it might go wrong.
Yeah, so his thought experiment is you imagine this color scientist who knows all the physical and functional facts about the phenomenal experience of colors, but she's raised in a black and white room and never sees a color other than black or white. You have to imagine her body is painted black or white or whatever, or that she never gets a cut and sees blood. And then she goes outside and she learns something new that is not something that she already knew. So she gains new knowledge. So the new knowledge must be knowledge that isn't part of the physical functional facts. Okay, so there's a pretty standard objection to this, which is that what she learns is not a new fact. It is a new way of conceptualizing a fact that she already knew. So she already knew that the sensation of red would occur in a certain circumstance, but she knew that via the physiological definition of it. And what she learns is a phenomenal concept of the same experience of red. So she gains new knowledge, but it's not knowledge of a new fact. Just as somebody can know that water is H2O, actually better, that water is H2O and knows various facts about water, and then comes to believe that there's H2O in the glass in front of them, where they didn't believe that before. That would be, if they already knew that there was water in the glass, and they used this identity to conclude that there's H2O in the glass, that would be new knowledge of a fact that they already knew. They already knew there was water in the glass, but now they know that there's H2O in the glass.
I'm going to contrast this thought experiment to yours, which, granted, we haven't explained it yet, but one of the things that I think is so great about it is that it does not push our intuitions into a very sort of crazy place. It's an easy thought experiment to grasp and grapple with. And something Dan says about this thought experiment in, I believe, his book, Sweet Dreams. It might be in Intuition Pumps. And he says this in our podcast, one of our interviews regarding swamp man cases, is that you just can't trust thought experiments when they push your intuitions really to the limits. And furthermore, you need to make sure that you're turning all of the dials and checking them in the thought experiment. And I think one of his responses to this one is that when we grant that Mary knows everything that there is to know about color, we can't really understand what that means.
I don't agree with that at all.
Okay.
No, she could learn everything that science has to tell you, and she still won't have a phenomenal concept of color. So I think his reply there is way off.
Okay.
And I know what his reply is to the blockhead example because I told it to him, and we had a long discussion about it.
Okay.
And he conceded. He said that, look, he conceded that you shouldn't define intelligence in terms of a behavioral disposition. He said you should define it in terms of a behavioral disposition that doesn't require exponential expansion of search. So he conceded that there has to be an internal requirement, which is what the blockhead is supposed to show.
So then without any further ado, since I've pushed us ahead of ourselves, what is the blockhead? How does the thought experiment run?
Okay, so maybe it's best to start with tic-tac-toe.
Okay.
Okay, so you can completely solve tic-tac-toe in the following sense. There are 9 squares. You can number them, 1 through 9. And then let's suppose your opponent gets to go number 1. So he can make any one of those 9 moves. And then if you're the machine, you need to respond by giving a response to each of those 9. And you put what you think is the best response. Then the person goes again, and then now because there have been 2 moves, there will only be 7 responses that you have to give a response to, and so on. And you can make a complete tree of tic-tac-toe where you tell the machine what to do no matter what the opponent does. Similarly, you can play the Turing test like that. You can say if you decide it's an hour-long Turing test, then you simply list everything that a person could type in an hour. So there's you settle on some maximum typing speed, and there will be a finite list of alphanumeric characters that can be typed in an hour. Of course, very, very large. Stuart Cheever shows very, very large, and the whole machine would have to be.
Was this in a response to your paper?
Yeah. So you just have to put in a response for each one of those. And then the machine can go again, but now you have fewer, just like in the tic-tac-toe case. And you could make a complete tree of everything for conversations lasting an hour. So it could do, and for everything the machine says in response to something that the person says, the machine, one of the programs can say, "I thought of that." So basically, it's a conduit for the programmers. It's like a puppet, except that the programmers have gone away, maybe died, and you are talking to the machine, and it is spewing out the things that the programmers put into it. So it's a brute force, completely memory-dominated machine that works basically the way a jukebox works. Mm-hmm. I think most people feel like that's not an intelligent machine. Every single thing it says is contributed by one of the programmers.
And so just to put a cap on it and summarize, what is supposed to happen when somebody sits down at the terminal and they're communicating with something on the other side?
Well, if we assume that the person on the other side goes first, what they're experiencing is they say something, and then the machine comes up with some clever response, and they say something again, and the machine comes up with some clever response taking the previous 2 into account. So, you could, for example, one of the things the person might say is, "I'm going to teach you a language." and then some teaching of a language, and then the programmers will have had to consider that possibility and put in an appropriate response to it. So I think what it shows is mere intelligent responding does not show intelligence of the machine that is doing the responding, because the machine's responses can be just conduits for something that somebody has put into it.
Am I right that you maybe in this paper you referred to it as a string searcher or the string searcher?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm,
And that became the blockhead.
That was one version of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, what I am then wondering is so the paper is titled Psychologism and Behaviorism.
Yeah.
We said a bit about what behaviorism is. What is psychologism, and then how does that connect?
Psychologism is the very minimal thesis that in order for behavior to reflect thought, you need an internal processing condition. And I don't say what that is, but I say there has to be some. And Dennett's proposal for without exponential expansion of search would be one hypothesis. But since we don't know what thought is, we can't really say what the internal processing condition is. But behavior isn't good enough. That's the idea of it. And the reason this has come up in regard to ChatGPT is that people realize that ChatGPT is very behavior dominated. And there's a recent paper by Raphael Millier and Cameron Buckner, which raised the question of the ChatGPT's and other large language models' intelligence in terms of to the extent to which it isn't a blockhead. So that the idea is that it isn't just reproducing what was in the database. Although I have to say that there are a lot of things that ChatGPT does that are very memory dominated. And I'll give you two examples. One example that I always use in my classes is that if you ask it, try this, ask it to draw a picture of a group of watches showing 3 minutes after 12. Okay, so the minute hand and the hour hand are very close together. What you will get is 10 after 10.
Huh.
And if you try to do 6:28, where the hands are very close together, you'll get 10 after 10 again. And the reason for this is that the pictures of clocks and watches on the web are dominated by 10 after 10 because it's the most attractive look. So you try it.
No, yeah,
I have tried this repeatedly, and everybody in OpenAI knows about this, and they have been unable to cure it.
That's crazy.
Oh yeah,
That's
everybody. This is a widespread example that people. It's been an example that people have pointed to for years,
and they still can't figure it out.
Well, I mean, they could. Maybe there's some
forward.
artificial way to do it, but to get the machine, the thing they use to deal with problems like this is called reinforcement training, but the reinforcement training hasn't worked. Probably because there are too many times other than 10 after 10 that would have to be reinforced. I'll give you a second example. Ask ChatGPT to draw a picture of somebody writing with their left hand. You always get a right hand. And I just did it. And I tried various tricks to get it to do a left hand. I've been able to get it to do a left hand, but it's not been easy.
Okay. Well, you seem like the right person to ask this question, even though it's not particularly philosophical, since you've been doing a lot of thinking about ChatGPT. This is something that a lot of people, not people who are philosophically inclined, notice, a lot of my friends, is that when I ask ChatGPT a question about a domain that I'm not very smart about, it often seems very convincing, and I'm definitely much better off deferring to ChatGPT than to my own knowledge about this subject.
Sure.
Of course, if I ask it something about some minutia in philosophy that I've been reading, it can be way off.
Yeah.
The question I wanted to ask, though, since it relates to what we've just been discussing, is why ChatGPT seems to be particularly bad at responding to queries about images, because I'll ask it, okay, draw a half weasel, half trout, and
Yeah.
it will give me something that does not resemble the weasel trout that I have been thinking
Yeah.
about.
Well, the training base for pictures is a collection of pictures with captions, and it's just not as big as the language database that it has. I mean, the language database is the whole damned internet, and the picture database is much smaller. And so, at least I think that's, a lot of the questions you might ask about why it can't do this or why, nobody knows the answer because they know how to train it, but it's a very difficult question to know why it does certain things and not certain other things.
And I'm of course not an expert in, well, you don't know this, but I'm not an expert in OpenAI, but my understanding is that a lot of their R&D is going back into something that has been trained and trying to figure out what's going on within it.
I think that's probably right. We don't know much about what OpenAI is doing. The last large language model of theirs that they described fully was GPT-3. And that's when it was so amazingly successful, they realized that they had something worth money. So they stopped publishing. And we don't even know how many parameters in the current version, although people have estimates. Mm-hmm. And we don't even know for sure how, although people can test this, how big the window of text is. You put a window of text in and it's predicting the next token, so-called, which is some word fragment based on that window. And the early ones had a rather small, couple thousand characters window of text, and we don't really know how big the window of text is, but you can do a couple of experiments with it to try to suss that out.
Have you seen the movie Ex Machina?
Mm-hmm.
Before I ask why I'm asking this, what do you think about it? I loved it.
I loved it too. I don't really remember it that well, but what about it?
The Turing Test is obviously a big part of the movie. You have this android woman who, maybe she's not an android. Is an android just a robot?
Yeah.
Okay, cyborg is mixed.
Yeah.
An android, and then...
I remember the basic plot.
Yeah.
She pretends to be somebody she's not, and then she manages to kill the guy.
Right. So she passes the Turing Test.
Yeah.
And the question that I have is whether or not you think that your blockhead, I think the answer is yes, could be rigged up and expanded in such a way that it could be an android among us and we would not be able to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think I mentioned that in one of the articles I wrote about it. Yeah, the same technique would work for an android too. Of course, we're talking about something as big as the solar system.
Okay, could you just briefly explain how this would work? Because it has got to be for most of our listeners to imagine that there could be a robot, that you could be a robot talking to me. We could be having this conversation. You're not controlled remote by the real Ned Block, but you could be totally unintelligent.
So the blockhead, as I described it, depends on there being a finite set of strings of letters that can be typed in an hour. It's that finiteness that allows a response to be given to each one. But of course, if you have a quantized robot with quantized sense organs and quantized behavior, so that it moves in tiny little jerks, which need not be something people could see, then the same finiteness assumption works for a robot. So as long as it's finite, the same thought experiment works. Of course, it gets more and more, impossible in the sense that the number of possibilities goes way, way up, and
Right. So maybe to try to make it a bit more concrete, we can imagine this committee of scientists and writers and just experts on human behavior.
Yeah.
They're given all of this data that a human-like creature could take in, such as visual data,
Yeah.
audio data,
Yeah.
olfactory data,
And they're coming up with responses that the machine would make in that case.
and then they're plugging it all into this
Yeah.
solar system-sized machine.
Right, exactly.
And okay, so maybe there's a wormhole connecting in the center of you. But okay,
I mean, look, to make it so that it could possibly work, one thought experiment would be that you discover that there is a kind of matter that's infinitely divisible. And so you could fit a lot of bits in a very small space.
yeah, yeah. Well, what then, given that psychologism, its criterion for, well, it doesn't have an explicit criterion for intelligence, but it says that for something to be intelligent, or for you to know if something's intelligent, you need to look at the information processing.
Yeah.
The behavior is not sufficient.
That's right.
Have you come up with criteria for information processing that you think would be
No.
sufficient?
No, and the reason I haven't, or nobody has, is we don't really have a good theory of what thought is. To have the information processing criterion, you need to know what thought is in computational terms, and we don't.
Then maybe this is kind of what the Turing test was originally developed for. I'm
Yeah.
wondering if there is an alternative test then.
No, I think the whole idea of looking for a test is a mistake.
Okay.
Measuring instruments get developed in the history of science in conjunction with theory about the nature of the thing you're measuring. The best studied example of this is the discovery of temperature and heat. There was a 17th century group in Florence that tried to measure what they call degree of heat. There are very good accounts of it. There's a good historical account by my wife, Susan Carey.
Yes. Yes, I was hoping to talk to her about her eventually.
So they, basically the reason this group in Florence was so important was they had glass blowing techniques for making thermometers. They were very advanced in making thin tubes. And so they could do a certain kind of measuring. They didn't know what heat was or temperature was. And so they didn't do a very good job. They didn't distinguish temperature from air pressure, for example. And they made things that were sort of partly barometers, and they didn't realize you had to make the tube of a uniform thickness. But they had some preparations that they had measured. So they would make some kind of a hot preparation and then do tests. They would heat a brick in a fire for a certain amount of time. And one test they had is, would this preparation melt paraffin, which is a waxy substance? And we know from our point of view that is temperature, because paraffin has a melting point, and you have to get above that melting point in temperature. But another test they had was how much ice would be melted in a certain period of time by the same preparation. And that measures heat. If you have a bigger hot brick, it'll melt the same temperature. It'll melt more ice, but it won't be any hotter in the sense of higher temperature. So these two things measure different things. They couldn't make a thermometer properly until they distinguished temperature from heat. And I think we're in the same situation about the mind. We want a measuring device to measure thought and reasoning, but we don't know if we've got the right categories. We need a theory of what they are.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was going to ask you. I mean, at the beginning of your response, you said, we don't know what thought is.
Yeah.
And what I was going to ask is thought, do we know this? Do we know if thought is a thing that is out there in the world that we're going to discover what it is, the way that we might discover what the fundamental particles are? Or is thought just going to be a concept that we use to sort of describe and understand?
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we've learned from ChatGPT is that thought-like processes divide. So ChatGPT, as I mentioned, can't do 4-digit multiplication. And the GPT-3 couldn't do 2-digit multiplication very well. But it has an amazing ability to do style and creativity. You know, you ask a question like, name of 50 fortune cookies that would give a caterpillar a bad day. And it comes up with amazing things. So, and the style I mentioned, it can do certain mental-like things. So maybe we've been thinking about thought wrongly. Maybe the rules and representations kind of thinking is like a completely different kind of process from the whatever, I don't even know what to call it, the things that it does well.
Well, now I think given where we are in our conversation, it's a good time to transition away from intelligence to some of the other many things that you've worked on. But before we do that, I was amazed when I saw that you were married to Susan Carey, because Susan Carey is one of the world's most renowned psychologists. I've spoken with many people who studied under her. And so it was just funny to see that these two worlds are actually one world. And what I am curious about is, I don't want to pry into your personal life, but you are married to another very stellar academic in a related area. I'm wondering how much of your lives together revolve around academic discussion, and whether you ever collaborate, or do you spend a lot of time talking about the mind, or how does
we spend some time talking about the mind, but mostly we talk about, entertainment, food,
that makes
friends.
Has her work in any ways influenced yours?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, she's doing fantastically interesting work that's of very huge interest to philosophers. I mean, her current line of work is especially interesting. She has done some experiments together with some of her collaborators that are showing that the whole language of thought picture that put forward by our common colleague Jerry Fodor is wrong, and that Fodor thought children come into the world with logical abilities of an adult, and they just have to use them to figure out what words mean and how the world works.
Is that sort of what Chomsky felt?
Yeah, Chomsky thinks something similar. What Susan and her colleagues have shown is that the basic logical operations of negation and disjunction, and also possibility and necessity, don't come in until you get the words for them in the right sense. Yeah, it's amazing.
That is
it's amazing work.
This might be a stretch, but what is the connection between something like this, where the words we have constrain our concepts and what we see, how we experience the world, maybe, with something like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis?
Well, this isn't culture relative as this, a Whorf thought
that cultures with very different terminology thought completely differently, and that's turned out to be nothing. I mean, there's some truth in it, but this is not really about anything culture relative, because all cultures are alike in these concepts. But this is about the importance of language to thought.
We've already spoken some about consciousness, and that's what I'd like to turn to next.
Sure.
And one of your main contributions in this area is the distinction between phenomenal and access consciousness.
Yeah.
So most people think of consciousness as maybe a univocal sort of thing.
Yeah.
Why is it not? What are the...
Well, remember I gave the analogy, the temperature analogy.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that helps to jumpstart an area is to take your concepts, like the degree of heat of these Florentine so-called experimenters, and realize that it decomposes into two separate ideas, temperature and heat. And similarly, I think that when we talk about consciousness in ordinary life, there are two really very different ideas that we have in mind. One is phenomenal consciousness, what it's like to have a certain experience, what it's like to, smell the roses or see red. And that's what's involved in the inverted spectrum hypothesis, the idea that maybe what you experience when you see red is like what I experience when I see green. And then there's access consciousness, I think that's it comes up in many other contexts. I think the Freudian unconscious, for example, is lack of access consciousness. So the idea is,
Interesting.
if you have some horrible traumatic event that you experience and you suppress it so that you deny that it ever happened, and your reasoning doesn't take it into account, but it comes out in your slips and dreams, you might have a phenomenal image that is phenomenally conscious, but not access conscious.
While we're on the topic of psychoanalysis, before we continue with phenomenal and access consciousness, I'm just curious how, as a very science-minded philosopher, you think of psychoanalysis. I'm not trying to make you put it down, but I am curious if you have any thoughts about it.
Well, I'm not a big fan of psychoanalysis. I mean, I had psychotherapy myself. It didn't do me any good, but I do think that something like the Freudian view of the mind is something we can see from our own experience. We can see that we do things that where other people know the motivation and we don't, because we don't want to recognize what the real motives are. So I think that some Freudian ideas really have a lot of truth, but I think it's hard to tell that except by reading novels and, subjecting your own behavior to scrutiny.
One thing that I really like about this conversation, and that I also really like about your work, is that there are lots of examples, and also lots of examples drawn from science, and you make that clear in your recent book, which will come up soon. But that being said, one of the phenomena that is very important to your work on access and phenomenal consciousness, and one that is also just one of the most interesting, fascinating phenomena about the human mind and brain, is blindsight. And in 250 plus interviews, I don't think blindsight has ever come up. So it is worth discussing and talking about it in this context.
So blindsight is a situation in which somebody has some big chunk of their earliest visual cortex, V1 in the back of the head, gone. And if you project an image so that it's processed by that, people say they don't see anything, but there are some patients who can guess very accurately as between an X or an O, or a vertical or horizontal line, things like that. So they have some kind of sight that is apparently at least not conscious. And that's called blind sight. There's been a debate among philosophers with Ian Phillips arguing that it really isn't blind, and Hak-Wan Lau and Mathias Michel replying, but the argument that it really is unconscious, and you can very quickly get into the weeds in this debate. So first of all, what is the overflow argument? Is an argument that there's more capacity to our phenomenology than there is in cognition. And one experiment that suggests that that's true is a famous experiment done by Sperling in 1960, where he showed people grids of, for example, 3 rows of 4 letters each. And after the lights had gone out, people said that they have a brief experience of the whole grid. But when you ask them to say what letters they saw, they can only give 3 or 4. But what he discovered was you could get 3 or 4 from each row if after the image went off, you gave a cue, a high tone for the top row, a low tone for the bottom row, and a medium tone for the middle row. And with that cue, people could give 3 or 4 from any given row. And that suggests that our capacity our phenomenal capacity encompasses something like 7 or 8 items, if you think of an alphanumeric character as an item. Whereas our working memory, which is the gateway into cognition, only has a capacity of 3 or 4 items of that sort. So that's the overflow argument. And change blindness is this wonderful phenomenon where a picture can change from one thing to another. And if you have something that distracts attention, people don't notice the change, even if it's a really big change.
Just that famous gorilla running onto the basketball
That's another
court thought
kind.
or experiment.
There's everybody knows about this. It's all over the internet. The idea is that experiment has suggested to many people that there is no difference between how many items in phenomenology and how many items in cognition, because they think phenomenology is very sparse. You don't see the gorilla. And actually, I'm part of a group that just did a recent experiment showing that view is wrong. So Dave Chalmers and I are part of a Templeton-funded research group, and this group did an experiment with slow change blindness, where a change is so slow that people don't notice it. And something you can, if you type slow change blindness in YouTube, you'll see some demos of that. And the sparse people who don't believe, sparse perception people who don't believe in the overflow argument, argue that the reason you don't notice the change is you don't really see the things that are changing. If it's a color changing, you don't really see the color that's changing. We only see a very small number of things that we're attending to. And what we showed is that actually people have a clear perception of the thing at a number of different stages, which those perceptions are, conscious perceptions are too evanescent to allow comparison. So it's a really good experience. The senior author on that is Jan Braskamp.
Since we're talking about seeing,
yeah,
I still would love, if we have time, to get back to some more questions about consciousness, just because you've got some greatest hits contributions to that area. But since we're talking about seeing, I'd like to ask about the border between seeing and thinking.
Okay.
And one, I'm curious why. I mean, you've got a lot of citations. You've worked on a lot of topics. Why was it that now you decided to write about this? But then, second, just to get us started, what is the difference between seeing and thinking? It's a good big question.
Yeah, so I wanted to work on this because I think I was originally led to it by the overflow argument. The idea that there's more in perception capacity in perception than there is in cognition. But I wanted to get clear about the difference between perception and cognition. So that's why I wrote this. And the difference I argue for is that perception is iconic in format, non-propositional and non-conceptual, whereas cognition is paradigmatically discursive, language-like, conceptual and propositional.
What is the difference between, well, maybe I should just ask if you could clarify what the format of perception and cognition would be, and then what the differences between format and content in this context.
Yeah, so format is, language has one format, pictures have another format. So the idea is that being picture-like is a different format from being language-like. Cognition is language-like in that sense, and perception is picture-like. To define it, there are a number of different definitions. The one that I like best is it's really due to Roger Shepard, the famous perceptual psychologist. And his version of it is that there's a kind of mirroring relation between the perceptual representations and the world.
Then the last sort of preliminary question I'd like to ask is, what is core cognition as it's referred to in the literature, and where does it fall around seeing and thinking?
So core cognition is something that I have a lot of trouble with.
Oh, yeah?
And that is a term that was invented by my wife and her colleague Liz Spelke, who were both, my wife just retired from Harvard and Liz Spelke is still there. And what they have argued is that there is these domains that are innate in humans, and which, at least at first glance, seem somehow intermediate between perception and cognition. And one of those is object perception, where we have certain innate capacities involving objects. We know that something doesn't go through, two solid objects don't go through each other. And infants are born knowing that. So some knowledge of the behavior of objects, some knowledge of relations among people, psychological, social relations among people, some elementary physics. And there's no agreement about exactly what the domains of core cognition are, but they at least include objects and some kind of personal relations, psychology of personal relations.
Since Susan has come up again, and we just spoke about her work as it related to language and thought or concept,
Yeah.
has she done any work on the connection between language and consciousness, or have you?
No, she has never done any work on consciousness, and we're going to have a meeting at NYU in the spring on infant consciousness, and she's going to be a discussant, but she didn't want to actually give a talk on infant consciousness because she's never worked on it.
Okay. Well, the reason that I wanted to ask about this is something that Jared brought to my attention. There's this, and it's a question that I've been asking most neuroscientists and philosophers of mine have been discussing since Jared brought it to my attention.
Yeah.
And it's this passage from Helen Keller's autobiography. Do you know what I'm going to refer to?
No.
Okay. Well, in her autobiography, I think he got this by way of one of Dennett's books, she is reflecting on her time as a child before her teacher came when she did not have language.
Yeah.
And she describes
She wonders whether there's a God exists.
No, that's not what I was going to say.
Oh, okay.
Is actually that she describes herself as being like this bumbling animal motivated by impulse, not really being able to grasp onto the world, having no memories from this time. And she says explicitly that she was not conscious. And what I'm wondering is what you think the connection is between language and consciousness, because I think this is vital to some theories of consciousness, and then whether or not you think she's right to have speculated or thought that she was not conscious.
Well, I certainly don't think she could have meant conscious in the sense of phenomenally conscious, because the description you gave does sound like she had experiences of bumping into things and what she called animal experiences. So I don't think she could have meant phenomenal consciousness. I suspect she meant something more like talking to yourself, an internal monologue. A similar point came up in this kind of cult book by Julian Jaynes called The Breakdown of Consciousness in the Bicameral Mind, or something like that. I wrote a review of it. It's on my website. And he argued that between the Odyssey and the Iliad, the Greeks discovered consciousness. And what he's going on is the idea that they didn't have internal monologues before a certain point. And so it was a similar idea of what he meant, something similar, I think, to what Helen Keller might have meant.
I can see, just from this question, just how useful the distinction between phenomenal and access consciousness is when discussing consciousness. But I guess that's one of the roles of philosophy, is making our concepts cleaner and more precise.
Yeah, and making relevant distinctions.
Right, so that we can better parse the world. Yeah. So actually now, given phenomenal and access consciousness, I'm wondering if this will add more color to just one question that I had about the animal minds. Yeah. And that's whether you think salmon, for instance, have phenomenal consciousness. I take it that you would say that they don't have access consciousness, but I want to make sure.
No, it's phenomenal consciousness I'm talking about.
Right. So you don't think they have that either?
No.
Okay.
No, great. I think whether they have access consciousness, I'm less sure about, but I think you need a cortex for phenomenal consciousness. That's my guess, anyway.
Interesting. I would have thought that phenomenal consciousness would be much more primitive than access.
Yes, I think that too.
Okay. But you're less sure about access consciousness.
Yes, because Of course, access consciousness in mammals is a matter of global broadcasting. And as far as I know, they don't have the capacity for that. So that is, perceptual areas send messages to a sort of central central facility in prefrontal cortex that gives it access to all these mechanisms of reasoning and problem solving. Salmon, I imagine, I don't know much about them, but I'm sure they can solve some problems. So that might be certain problems involving the perceptual representations that they have. So there may be some form of access there.
Interesting that perceptual representations can be accessed in access consciousness while not being phenomenal. But I guess that's what we were talking about with Blindsight earlier, to some extent. I mean, or maybe
it's a certain form of access, but it's very limited access in Blindsight.
Right.
Because they can't do. First of all, they can't. They have to be prompted.
Yeah.
Guess as between a 0 and a 1. Guess as between a horizontal or vertical line. If you don't prompt them, they don't guess and they have no idea what they're seeing.
You just mentioned global broadcasting.
Yeah.
And you said earlier that there were 4 main theories of consciousness.
Yeah.
What I'd like to do now is hear a bit about these 4 and then whether or how the border between seeing and thinking might affect which one you think is correct.
Yeah. Okay, so the 4 are the global broadcasting, which we just talked about.
Okay, so global broadcasting and global workspace are the same.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, broadcasting in the workspace. So that is an idea put forward first by Bernie Bars, but really the person who's run with it and developed it is Stanislas Dehaene, famous cognitive neuroscientist in France. And the idea is that we have stimulation of perceptual areas in the back of the head. That nature has kindly divided these capacities into the front and the back, so it makes it easier to talk about them. And then those representations compete for dominance. And the winner can trigger, that's his term, a large neural coalition between the front of the head and the back of the head. And that's global broadcasting. When a perceptual representation is globally broadcast, which takes maybe 400 milliseconds after the perception, then that information is available to many different cognitive facilities of reasoning, problem solving, betting, reporting. And he thinks that's what makes the representation conscious. I think there's a slightly better version of it put forward by the neuroscientist Claire Sargent, another French neuroscientist, who's actually a student of Dehaene's. She calls it the global playground, and I won't get into why I think it's better, but I think it is a better version of it. Okay, so that's that theory. Then a second one that's very has a lot of adherents is what's sometimes called the higher order thought theory, and I think the most impressive version of that is one put forward by Hak-Won Lau, a neuroscientist who's in Japan and is just moving to Korea. And the idea about that is that if you have a perceptual representation in the back of the head, the default is it's an unconscious representation. To make it conscious, you need a frontal pointer to it, which is sort of thought-like, but is cognitive pointer. And that's what makes it conscious. And there's a lot of support for that, I think. A third view is that, put forward originally by Victor Lamy, a Dutch psychologist, a neuroscientist, is that certain kinds of activation in the back of the head are enough for perceptual consciousness, involving some kind of recurrent loops in the back of the head. And there's some experimental support for that as well. The fourth is the integrated information theory put forward by Giulio Tononi and advocated by Christoph Koch. And that says that consciousness, so that has a slightly different focus from the other ones. The other ones are about what makes a perceptual representation conscious. The primary focus of the integrated information theory is what makes an organism or a system conscious. And it says that it's a matter of how differentiated the system is, a certain kind of differentiation and a certain kind of integration. So and that has it's really quite a different view from the other three are more of a piece. And I mean, the thing that's one of the things that's odd about the integrated information theory is it has some absolutely bizarre consequences. So, a diode, anything with two states and a minimal memory is conscious, according to conscious to some extent. So that means a lot of machines, your phone is conscious to some extent. And furthermore, as a result of an objection made by the quantum mechanics guy, Scott Aronson, he showed that, and this is accepted by the IIT people, that if you take a exclusive OR gate and put them in a square or a circuit, and then add more of them to that circuit, you can get something that's way more conscious than we are just by stringing together these XOR gates.
Huh.
Now, that's a very bizarre consequence.
Yeah.
And it's enough to make people feel like you really need some strong evidence for this. And I myself don't believe that the evidence is there, but it has some nice properties and has some advocates.
Before we talk about where the border between seeing and thinking informs your selection of these four theories, I just want to clarify it, and I want to save a fuller discussion of this for if we end up speaking with Dave at some point.
Yeah.
But you did not refer to dualism, panpsychism.
Oh yeah, I'm talking about the kinds of
scientific,
respectable theories.
Okay, and those are not on your view.
Okay, I wouldn't go that far.
Okay, I'm not trying to push you into a corner.
No, look, I think that that dualism is respectable. It's just not something pursued in the science of consciousness. But there are plenty of scientists who believe it, who are dualists.
That's good to know. I'm somewhat surprised to hear that you think it's a respectable theory just because you are so scientifically minded.
Yeah, but I think the arguments for it are just not scientific arguments, but they're another kind of argument.
Okay, great. And so where do you fall among these four theories, and how do seeing and thinking figure into it?
I like the Lamé kind of theory best, but I'm not
Is that higher order thought?
No, but I like that one a little bit too. I'm not an advocate of any of these really, because my view is we don't know enough to make a decision. I'm a scientifically minded person. I want to see, a lot of the theorizing about consciousness is done by egomaniacs. People who, I have my theory of consciousness and I am going to do experiments that prove it. And then they do, demonstration experiments that have very little chance of not coming out to be compatible with their theory. No, I feel like we don't know what consciousness is in the brain. I feel like we know enough to know that to have a pretty good reason for thinking that something brain-like may be required. So I believe that meat may be required for consciousness, to put it in an extreme way.
Okay, fascinating. Does that mean that you think the substrate has to be organic like us, or just something with an organization like our brain?
I think we don't know that, but I think there's something about the biological nature of our brain that makes us conscious, and that we would do well to not assume that we can make a conscious machine that doesn't have that biological.
So that would
properties.
preclude something like ChatGPT becoming conscious
Yes.
just because of its physical architecture.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Now, of course, I don't feel that that we have enough of a theory of what consciousness is to rule out ChatGPT, but I'm skeptical.
And what then are some of the other key takeaways, if any, from the border between seeing and thinking that you think would be accessible to people who haven't read the book? Because I know I was going to say it's technical, but it's not technical in the philosophical
No,
sense,
I
and
try
that's
to
not logical,
I try to
but-
make it intelligible to a lay reader.
Okay, and it's open access. That's
It's
something-
open access, yeah.
Can you explain to that, what people?
Yeah, you go to the OUP, the Oxford University Press website, and they try to disguise the fact that it's open access. But
That's-
what you'll see, they have a button to buy it, but you'll see there's an open lock next to the button to buy it. And if you click on that, you can download the PDF. And if people don't get it that way, they can go to my website where I have another way of getting it to it. I think the best chapter for a lay reader would be chapter 6, where I argue that color perception is non-conceptual. I explain what that means, and I use data from infants, which is really cool stuff, and it's easy to understand. I show in that chapter, using the work of a color developmental color scientist named Anna Franklin at the University of Sussex. I use her work to show that 4 to 6 month old infants have almost adult level color perception. And then I use the work of many cognitive developmental psychologists to show that normally the children between about 4 to 6 months and 1 year have no color cognition at all.
Okay.
And it's really cool stuff.
Well, we're coming full circle with my last question. We started off talking about Putnam a bit.
Yeah.
And you mentioned functionalism as
Yeah.
one of his views that he's best known for. And it's one of the views you're best known for criticizing.
Yeah.
And my question to finish us off is if quite briefly, in a sentence or two, you could recap what functionalism was or is, and then if you could just explain your thought experiment in troubles with functionalism that does away with it.
Yeah. So I don't actually endorse that argument anymore.
Okay.
So the idea is that, so functionalism is the view that the role of a representation in your mental economy is what gives it its mental properties. And specifically, its production by inputs, its effect on outputs, and the way it interacts with other representations in the system. And I have become something of an advocate of functionalism with respect to thought and reason. Where I don't think it's plausible is with respect to consciousness. And the thought experiment I gave, this predates Searle's Chinese room argument, but it is almost the same exact thing. And he read my paper, so he got it from
Is that a source of unhappiness or strife?
It's a little bit, because he's a guy who never concedes where he got ideas from.
Okay.
So the idea was you could imagine the thought experiment as I did it was you can imagine a robot controlled by a large group of people talking with walkie-talkies. They would be the brain.
Is this the nation of China?
Nation of China, yeah, that's right, yeah. And which is another thing I think Searle got from my version
is
of
funny.
it.
That's a bit heavy-handed.
Yeah. Well, he said when I saw him in an early presentation of his Chinese room argument that he had read my paper and that this was different.
Okay.
But it isn't very different. So I don't think these intuitions are worth that much. But I think the main argument against a functionalist view of consciousness is that the nature of consciousness looks to be something more biological. Every advance we've made on what consciousness is heavily duty biological. So I don't think that such a superficial theory like functionalism could possibly be right.
And is this what you mean when you say that even though you're still not a fan of functionalism, it's not, or this is why you no longer really hold to the thought experiment, because you find the arguments about biology to be more convincing or important. Is that what you're referring to?
I find them to be important, and I no longer think that intuitions of that sort are that useful.
Okay. Thanks
So
for
maybe I agree
clarifying.
with Dennett on that.
Okay, great. Well, Ned, this is an episode that I really wanted to do for a very long time. So thank you so much for coming up
Oh,
here.
thank you.
I'm
It was
assuming
fun.
you're down there. Yeah, it was really great. And hopefully we sit down with Dave one day. That would also be
Okay,
great.
cool.